started. Thank you for joining us today. We are excited to talk with children's authors Loriel Ryon and Tae Keller. If you have questions for them, you can post them in the chat and we will get to them at the end of the program. So first I'm going to start by introducing our authors. Loriel is an author of middle grade fiction. She spent her childhood with her nose in a book, reading in restaurants, on the school bus, and during every family vacation. Her upbringing in a mixed heritage military family inspires much of her writing about that wonderfully complicated time between childhood and adulthood. Also a nurse, she lives in the magical New Mexico desert with her husband and 2 daughters. Her debut middle grade novel is Into the Tall, Tall Grass. And then Tae Keller grew up in Honolulu, Hawaii, where she subsisted on kimchi, purple rice, and stories. Now she writes about biracial girls trying to find their voices and lives in Seattle with a multitude of books. Her middle grade novel, When You Trap a Tiger, just won the 2021 Newbery Award, given annually to the most distinguished contribution to American literature for children by the American Library Association. So welcome to both of you. We're so glad to have you. And since you guys are leading the conversation today, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'll turn off my camera and I'll be back at the end for questions.
Thank you so much. This is so fun.
I know, this is great. I'm happy to be here. Tae, thanks for doing this with me.
Yeah, I always think it's fun to talk to other authors and kind of get to know their process. So I'm kind of curious, just to start it off, can you, for everyone, tell us a little bit about the book and also what inspired you to write the book?
Sure. So Into the Tall, Tall Grass is an upper middle grade novel about a girl she's a 12-year-old girl, and everyone in her family has a magical trait except for her. So she's a little bit sour about that. She has a twin sister who she's pretty jealous of, and her father is off fighting in like a war, like just in the military. So he's far away, and then her grandmother is like her guardian is in a coma. And basically one day everything's not looking good for Yolanda. And then one day this mysterious grass grows up in the desert behind her home. Her grandmother wakes up from her coma and asks Yolanda to take her to the pecan tree on their land in hopes of saving her life. And so Yolanda and her twin sister, who she doesn't really get along with, and her ex-best friend and a boy who has a crush on her, and her naughty little French bulldog named after a famous woman scientist, embark on this journey through the grass to try to save her grandmother's life. So it's got girls in STEM, it's a little bit of magical realism, it's got naughty little dogs, sister rivalries, best friend relationships, there's LGBTQ characters, magic, there's all kinds of stuff in there. And it's funny because the story idea started with the image of this girl standing in front of this expanse of grass in the desert. And it actually comes from one of my early childhood memories, where my dad was in the military, so he would be gone on the cruise ship for 3, 6, 8 months. And so my mom would take us to go visit her family in South Texas for like the whole summer. And when we would come back, our house would still be there, but she had hired this guy to cut the grass in the front yard while we were gone, but he didn't do the backyard. And so we were gone all summer, and we came home in the evening, and I remember my grandpa like opened the blinds to the back porch, and it was like that orangey kind of light, and the grass had grown as tall as the house. And I was like 4 or 5, I don't know, just looking, and I was like, oh my gosh. And he was like, don't go out there, Mija, there's snakes out there, it's too dangerous. And so they had to like machete the grass down before they could mow it. And I had asked my mom recently, did that really happen? Or was it just that big because I was so little? And she was like, oh no, it was as tall as the house. It had grown that tall. So
that's wild.
That's where I started with like this. I was like, well, what if instead of like in Florida, which is where I was living at the time, what if it grew up in the desert? Like that would be really, where I live now, that would be really sort of spectacular. And then I was like, well, why is she going in the desert? And I just kind of kept asking myself questions to kind of get myself there. And then it just kind of blossomed from there, really. But that was the first thing that started. It was like this girl in front of the tall grass.
I love that. That just sounds magical. And
right?
to see it as a little kid, like that must have completely imprinted in your brain.
Did.
Like,
honestly,
magic.
It's the earliest thing I can remember. And it's a house that like even my brother doesn't remember living in. So it definitely like stained my brain.
Well, that's amazing. I'm glad that it led to this book because I really enjoyed this book.
Oh, thank you. Well, I really enjoyed your book, When You Trap a Tiger. I think it is like so beautiful. And I love the similar themes that our books kind of touch on with the magic and the grief and the grandma and like the sister. Like it all kind of was very cool for me to read after writing my book. Can you tell me a little bit about what about your life, or what inspired you to take on this story?
Yeah, so this story is about a girl named Lily who has grown up with her hominy, her grandmother's Korean fairy tales, and these stories in some ways start to come to life for her. And I think so. The story for me started years ago, and this was when I was in college. And I grew up in Hawaii, and my family's there, but I had left Hawaii, and I was back for some winter vacation probably. And I was really missing home, and I was really missing this connection to my family and to my culture. And so I asked my grandmother to teach me how to make kimchi, because I thought, maybe this will help me connect. Like if I learn to make kimchi, then I'll feel more connected to my family and to home. And while we were making kimchi, she started to tell me these stories about her life and her childhood in Korea and how she had grown up, how she came to the US. And I realized as she was telling me this that I hadn't ever heard these stories from her. And that was kind of a shift for me because I had grown up hearing stories from her my whole life, but the stories that she always told me were fairy tales. They were these Korean fairy tales, and that was how I connected with her. And when I thought of my hominy stories, I thought of these fairy tales, this fantasy. And it was just such a shift to also hear her real life and the ways that her real life stories paralleled the fairy tales that she had told us in some ways and also differed in some important ways. And so those ideas of the different stories that we get from our family and the ways that they converge and they inform us and our understanding of identity kind of made its way into When You Trap a Tiger. But of course, that like, as that's just the seed in the beginning, right? And then it just evolves and evolves and evolves.
That's awesome. I love that. I love the grandparent connections, like in both of our books. Like there's so much magical folklore with the stories that Harmony tells Lily, and then there's like in my book there's like this whole other POV of the grandma kind of telling what happened to her and her sister and everything back in the day. And I just love like how, I don't know, I think this age, the 12-year-old age time, is like when you start to kind of realize that your grandparents were people.
Yes.
And they're not just like this sort of, I don't know, like these very perfect beings that you love so much. You start to notice like maybe their imperfections or their flaws, and but you still love them anyways, right? But it's like the first time that you can kind of put the pieces together of their almost like their humanity in what your relationship with them, plus like all these things kind of come together at 12, I feel like, or that age.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's what I love so much about middle grade is it's that age where you're realizing that the world exists outside of you. So you realize that with your grandparents, with your parents, with your siblings and your friends, and it's kind of just recontextualizing the world and how you fit into it, which I love. I love writing about that time.
Yeah, me too. That's like I don't know. That was like when my world kind of blew up, like, you know, when I realized all that. So I can't even imagine, like, yeah, that's how it is for kids, right?
Yeah.
That's
What
awesome.
was it about a grandparent relationship that made you want to write about it, or that you felt was important to write about?
So I like growing up, I was really fortunate. I had like all of my grandparents were alive. And actually, like when I go back and think about that age, what was my biggest fear? Like when I was 12 or whatever, it was probably losing somebody, like having someone die, or you know, some horrible thing happening to like someone in my family. And the only people that I felt were really at risk for that were like my older grandparents, right? Because I like, and my grandfather in particular on my mom's side, because he was much older than like my other grandparents. And so like when I was deciding what I wanted to write and explore, I was thinking, well, you know, my biggest fear was losing a grandparent. And then I actually did, but I didn't lose him until I was in college. So I was trying to decide, like, how do I explore this from like a kid's perspective, and what that would be like to lose a grandparent so young, but like love them so much, and how would you deal with that? And so in that's kind of where it started with. Because yeah, I mean, probably losing my grandfather was like one of the hardest things I went through ish. Like there was some, like my parents went through a divorce and stuff when I was younger, but like that grief and loss, that was my first real experience with it. I had lost some great grandparents, but I wasn't very close to them. They spoke only Spanish on one side, and then the other ones, they were very much older, and we only saw them once in a while. And so it wasn't that visceral connection like I had with my grandparents, who I was very close with. So I don't know. And there's something so cool about grandparents. I just love them. What about
Yeah.
you? Is that you had a close relationship with your grandparents? Is that why you were talking about your grandmother?
Yeah, so I was always really close with my hominy, but she's kind of the only grandparent that I had a close relationship with. And part of it is that, like you're saying, like grandparents are so cool. And I think that a lot of that comes from the stories that they have collected over the years, and just the idea of all these years of stories and how they come together is really compelling to me. And also I think that what you're saying rings really true to me about that fear and asking yourself that question, what happens when we lose someone that we love? And a lot of this book came from my fear about that, because my homony's still with us, thankfully.
Oh,
But
that's so
she,
awesome.
yeah, but she has Alzheimer's. So it's been great to be able to spend time with her, but it's been really hard to see her losing these stories, losing these memories, and knowing that this end is going to come. And so
Right.
I think when I write, a lot of it is just me asking myself the question, what happens when this
Right.
thing that I'm so deeply afraid of, what happens when it happens? And how do you prepare for that? And how do you make peace with it in a way? And what do you do? And so I think, I don't know if I found an answer in writing it,
I don't know that
but
there is an answer,
yeah,
right? Like I
yeah,
think we have our own way of processing it. It was, I think something else with the grief and loss like topic was that like no one in my family really talked about this. Like it was very like sort of taboo. We don't talk about that. Like, I mean, they were Catholic, and so there was like talk of heaven, and we did funerals and things like that. But like I really wanted to talk about it. Like I wanted to go deep and like uncomfortable with it. And like nobody really wanted to do that. And so I was like, you know what? I think we should have some books out there that go deep and uncomfortable with kids, because I think they're really curious about it. And maybe this is a good way for them to explore that, right? Like all those like really complicated feelings about loss.
yes. I find that with books today, like
Yeah.
books help me process things and prepare for things that I'm afraid of. I know that that was true for me when I was in middle school and I was reading. And I think that that is just also true for writing. I think that stories are such a safe place to explore these things.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that's 100%. Um, so why or how did you decide to weave like magic and folklore into these like tough topics of grief and loss? Like what made you kind of talked about the stories that your grandmother used to tell you. And so was that like the starting place? And then how did the tiger come about? I want to know.
So this book went through 20 revisions. So there was a lot of trial and error. And a lot of that trial and error was about the myths and the folktales. So the way that I wrote this is that at the beginning of the book, there is a folktale about the sun and the moon. And that is somewhat similar to Little Red Riding Hood, where a tiger dresses up as the grandmother and tries to trick the two little kids into letting him into the house. And, they run away from him, they run up into the sky, and the siblings become the sun and the moon. And that was my favorite story growing up. And I would always ask my hominy for the tiger story because it felt so magical. And I knew that if I was writing a book about Korean stories, it had to center this story that I loved so much. And so that's where this tiger character comes from. And then as the book progresses, the tiger tells Lily more stories. And so there are 2 more stories that the tiger says. And I had always thought for a long time, through many revisions of this book, that those stories would also be just Korean fairy tales, in the same way that the Sun and the Moon story is different a little bit, but is very faithful to that original story. But it wasn't quite working that way. No matter how much I tried to force the stories in and force it to connect, it wasn't really paralleling the main plot and the emotional arc. And I think that a lot of that was because those are very old stories, of course. And I think that the exciting thing to do when working with myth and folktale is to take them and adapt them and to evolve them into our current reality and contemporary stories. And I found that in order for this book to work, in order for the stories to resonate with Lily, the character, but also I hope with the reader, I had to update them in a way and kind of, I had to give myself permission to do that too, because I think that I was very worried about being respectful to these stories and to my culture. And in order to update them, I couldn't just willy-nilly write a new thing. I had to go and do a lot of research into Korean history and into my family stories, and use that research to build something new. And so it was a very long, involved process, but it's one in which I learned so much. I learned so much about being Korean and the ways that I am connected to my culture and the ways that stories connect me to my culture. And so even though it took 20 drafts to get there, I'm really glad that I went through that process, because I just learned so much as a person and as a writer. But yeah, I think it's fascinating. I think it's fascinating when people use stories in stories. So I'm very curious about your answer to that and how that worked for you.
Yeah. So, well, I want to say something about yours real quick. So I was talking with another couple authors like a couple weeks ago, and we were kind of talking about how, expected story structures are for like Western type of stories. And so because we're publishing in the US and all of that, like we are expected to kind of adhere to the Western story structure, and how trying to incorporate folktales, myths, other things from our other parts, of the world or the other parts of culture don't necessarily fit into that mold of Western style of storytelling. And so I wonder if that's like part of the issue, right? Like, because maybe those Korean myths and folktales that you were working with, that you really wanted to, stay true to, maybe they didn't fit like the typical structure of like a story, or like of what we say as like Western story, right? And so like, I don't know, I just really love that you like kind of, you know, went with it and like learned about your family and learned about the culture and tried to like build it authentically. And like, it's hard. It's got to be hard, right? To sit there and you're writing like a biracial character and you want to be like honor the family and like the culture and everything, but like you also are like trying to, you know, pull from pieces that are not all there, right? And so I just really think that that's, I don't know, I think it's really cool. I think the book is amazing and better for all of that work you did and all those revisions. I mean, that thing just pops. It's so good.
Thank you.
I love it.
I do think that is really true about the Western framework that we're so used to. I don't know if you've heard of the book Craft in the Real World.
I just
but
got it.
Oh my gosh, it's so good. It's so good. It talks a lot about that in a way that is really interesting and kind of blew my mind a little bit. So
yep. That's what made me think of it. Was I was just reading that book the other day and I'm like, yes, this is what that is.
Yeah.
So that's super cool.
But
so
I
like
also sorry. I think that is really true. And also when I was writing about Lily, who is biracial and Asian American, I think that part of it was that it had to combine both Korean culture and American culture because that's what was true for her. She is Asian American, she is white and Korean, so she has all these influences like I do. And so I think that that's also exciting to be able to combine culture into something new.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. I think, you know, it's hard, right? It's hard being like bicultural and, you know, I consider myself bicultural, I guess. And it's hard because you do have influences from, you know, different sides and you can't really be authentically 100% to either one because you are this like new thing or this like blended thing. So you can't like divide it up. You can't, and you really can only like do it from the perspective that you know, right? And so like even just like with the Spanish in my book, I know a little bit of Spanish. My grandmother spoke Spanish to me, you know, as a kid. And I speak Spanish to my kids, the tiny phrases that I know, right? Like I don't know a lot. And so, but like keeping that in the book, right? But like I still need a little bit more Spanish, but like maybe my main character doesn't understand all that Spanish because she is like, you know, she didn't learn Spanish because the whole point was like for the family to assimilate and not speak Spanish. And so only the grandparents speak Spanish. And so there's just all these little things that kind of tease out when you're blending the two sides, I think. And I think you did a lovely job in your book of like making that very clear with Lily and seeing where like she was trying, I forget what she was trying to make. Was it kimchi or was she making something else? I feel like she was
duck. Yeah, like Korean mochi.
Yes. And she was like having a hard time with it and like doing like kind of struggling. And I was like, oh my God, this reminds me of my grandmother trying to teach me how to make corn tortillas and they're all falling apart. And she's like, you don't have enough water, you know, all of that. And so it was just like, even though I'm not Korean, you know, Korean at all, the biracial aspect of, and the bicultural aspect of struggling with that part of your identity or struggling a little bit, trying to figure stuff out that your grandma's trying to teach you to make, like just rang so true. Because like those are the experiences that I had, right? So
yeah, I love what you're saying about the language too, about Spanish, because that is really similar to how I felt about Korean. It's like I grew up hearing it and knowing phrases, but I don't speak it, and wanting to put phrases into the book, but then also worrying that I don't speak Korean and I'm worried about getting stuff wrong. But then I'm also like, but it is true to my experience being biracial.
It's absolutely. I think that's maybe another reason too why I just loved your book so much, because I just, you know, like I'm not Korean at all, right? But like all those themes and all those things that were kind of just like laced throughout were so authentic and like true to my own experience, you know, as a bicultural person. And so I just love that like these books are out there for kids, because I don't think I ever read a bicultural or biracial character until I was an adult. And God, that would have been so cool as a kid to have been able to see that and read that and kind of be like, yes, this is kind of a thing on its own. Like, not too many people really understand what it means to be kind of split between, you know, two cultures. I don't know.
Yes. But I do think it's becoming more and more common in the next generation.
Yes.
So
there's so many kids, right?
Yeah.
Like so many kids.
Yeah. So I feel very kind of, it's like an honor and a responsibility to be writing that. And I'm so glad that you're writing books like that, and there are other writers out there.
Yeah, I agree. I love it so much. Okay, let's see. Oh, I was going to talk a little bit about the structure. So with Into the Tall, Tall Grass, the structure is a little different for a middle grade book. Mine with the magic, it has like the magical trait in the family. So everyone has a magical trait except for the main character. And then, but it's like, I'm also really into science. I'm a nurse, and I studied biology and like virology and like microbiology and stuff in college. And I just am fascinated by genetics. And so in this book, the magical trait is actually a genetic trait that the family has. And so they pass it from in the mitochondria from like mother to kids. And so all the women in the family pass it on. And so it was kind of interesting because I was talking to a bookseller, and she goes, the structure of your book goes like with Yolanda, the main character, and then it kind of switches to the POV of the grandmother, which, you know, having a grandmother POV in a middle grade is not super common. She's like, so why did you decide to do that? And I was like, well, the grandmother's like 12 also, kind of, you know, so she's kind of a kid at the time. But I just like the intergenerational stories kind of needed to weave together because the setting was the same. And so she kind of like did this, and I was like, oh my gosh, I just did like a DNA double helix structure, didn't I? And she's like, yeah, you didn't know that? And I was like, oh my God, I did. So it's like a double helix structure is like the whole structure of the book. And I don't know that I even really realized that when I was doing it, but like this other very smart person figured it out for me. So now I can say like, yeah, my book structure is a DNA double helix between a grandmother and a granddaughter, like their stories intertwining. And almost like the roots of a tree, which is like a super important part of the book too. So
I love that.
So it's just kind of like one of those little like, that's kind of cool. I love that.
I love when your own writing surprises you.
Yes.
Like, oh, I guess I am smart.
Well, she had asked me a question and I was like, oh my God, you're right. I did do that.
Yes.
Like, really?
Did you write one of them first, one of those timelines first, and then the other one, or did you write it interspersed?
So the very first part of the book is pretty much Yolanda. I think it's like the first 25% or so. And there's like a journal entry in there a little bit with Wella's voice. And Wella actually just kind of butted in. And I was not like, this was my first like middle grade that I was really being serious about. And I'm like, you cannot have a grandma be in a middle grade. Like a 93-year-old woman cannot be butting in here. But she was persistent. And so I was like, you know what? I'm just going to go with it. I can fix this on revision. And we're just going to see where this story goes. Because I knew the beginning and I knew the end, and I did not know the middle at all. So I was just like, we got to get to the end, like just keep going. And so she just kind of took over, and her stories just kind of interspersed, and they were not perfect at all. Like the first 5 revisions, you know, I was still kind of fixing timeline issues and making sure it was kind of cohesive. But actually, yeah, it kind of went back and forth a little bit. And then I had to move some stuff and, you know, fix it in revisions, but really it just sort of organically kind of went together, which was kind of cool.
That's amazing.
Yeah. I also didn't know how I was going to fill like whatever 60,000 words with Yolanda on this journey. I was like, somebody else has to come in here, because like she can only complain so much before people are going to be sick of her.
Wella to the rescue.
Yeah, exactly. Yolanda's sort of this like unlikable, lovable gal. Like she's super grouchy and grumpy, which I totally was as a kid. So I can relate to her on that level.
I don't think she's unlikable at all.
You don't think so? Oh, good.
I mean, she's struggling. It's hard to be that age. So, but like I very much empathized with her.
Yeah. I mean, she's really in a tough situation at the beginning of the book. So, and she just doesn't have all the best coping skills, but she kind of learns them along the way, which is cool. I don't know. Okay, I want you to talk a little bit about your revision process because I was mentioning to Tae earlier that I went on her Instagram stories and she has the whole like when you trap a tiger, like her, I don't know, confessionals about like revision, and I just wanted to hear a little bit about that.
Oh, the revision process. I wish that I now had, after going through the struggle of revising When You Trap a Tiger, I wish that I now had a laid out process that I could follow. It seems that that's not the case. It seems that every book I have to relearn how to do this. But I think that what has worked for me in my first few books has been focusing on one single thing in each revision. Because otherwise, if I'm trying to think about characters and plot and theme and everything all at once, then I just kind of shut down.
Too much.
How does anyone write a book? This is crazy. So one revision, I will just focus on this is the main character and this is what they need in the beginning. This is how they think that they can accomplish what they need. But of course, that's never how that works out. And this is how they actually accomplish what they truly need in their hearts. And so I'm just tunnel vision on one thing. And then the next one will be about the setting and making sure that the setting feels very real and also that the environment relates in some way to what the characters is feeling. So I feel like it's all layering on top of each other. And of course, it's never really that easy.
Simple, yeah.
Yeah.
Because you change one thing and then it's like all the way down.
Exactly. I just kind of am setting up dominoes for myself and then I'll accidentally knock it over again. But I find that I feel like I know the book a lot better if I know each individual thread, and then I can kind of weave it together and then unweave if I have to and then try again. Yeah.
That's awesome. So how did you not lose, I don't know, like, because you did a lot of revisions. You said you had like 20 revisions. Did you ever like just want to throw the whole thing away and give up and like start with something new, or like what kind of kept you going?
Yes, I really did multiple times. I think that the hardest point, so this was, I think, maybe 13 revisions in, and I had written a draft and sent it to my editor, and every draft she kept saying, I really believe in this story. I can see what you're trying to do, but it's not quite working. And every time I was like, oh, I know, but I don't know how to make it work. So on my 13th revision, after getting back another letter like that, I sat down and I was like, okay, I have to finish it. This is mentally exhausting. It's emotionally exhausting. I can't keep going through this. So I'm going to just give it everything that I have. And if that doesn't work, then it doesn't work. Yeah. And I spent the next 2 months just like 10-hour days, just revising this and putting this in. And it was kind of this last push. And I was like a year past my deadline at this point. So.
Oh no.
Yeah.
You're like, what's 2 months?
Right. So I gave it everything and I sent it to my editor and I was like, I think that I did it. I think that I finally got where it needs to be. And she sent me back the sweetest email of, I believe in your writing. I see what you're trying to do. But she's like, but it's not really working. And I just, I cried. I was like,
no.
I give up. Let's pay back the advance.
Oh no.
I had already spent the advance. I'd already had a wedding, so I couldn't pay back the advance. So I was like, okay, I mean, kind of stuck here. So that is the point when I could not come back to the computer. I could not draft again. And that's when I started doing the research. I started researching Korean history and really digging back into that and building off of the base that I just kind of gleaned over the years from my family, and really studying it and looking at the original folk tales. And I started to see all these parallels in the book that I didn't even realize were there. Kind of these little seeds,
like
that
things
I had,
you already had like known, like
yes,
somewhere in you, right? But you hadn't pulled them out. Oh, that's awesome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like, oh, like somehow these stories are inside of me and I didn't even realize it.
Oh,
and
that's amazing.
It felt like magic, like just the way that writing sometimes feels like magic. And it felt like such a gift after feeling like I was just pushing so hard and it wasn't working. And it felt like a sign that I was moving in the right direction and that this book was still something that I should be writing. And so that doing all that research kind of unlocked all of these ideas and the right path that the book should go in. But yeah, that revision process, it was not easy.
No. Well, and I love how you say that, because I felt like I'm writing a second book as well. And I'm getting stuck where I'm like, I know where I'm trying to go with this and it is stuck. And there's some piece that needs to like come through and it's not, I can't figure it out. And what did I do? I went back and started doing a bunch of research, because I have like a lot of, I don't know, so far my 2 books have like a science basis as the framework. So like with the first one, it's mitochondrial DNA, like genetic pedigree family thing. And then this one's more like physics and Chladni patterns and different things. But until I like went and started like a YouTube deep dive into like the history of physics and all this stuff, I was like, oh, it is there somewhere. I know this, but I have to like figure out how to pull that, like you said, like it was already there, but you just have to like figure out how to pull it out into the story. And so I think that's so smart. And like, I love that. I love that it was already in you. You just didn't even know it yet.
Yes, I'm so glad that you are having the experience of feeling like, it's there and you can pull this together.
One day we'll get there.
Are you able to talk about it? Is it too soon?
It's set in the bayou. And it's another 12-year-old girl and there's some magic in it. And it isn't sold or anything yet, but that's what I've been working on. And then of course, like all these other fun ideas come into my head when I'm like supposed to be working on this one. So I have a couple of like rough drafts and different things that I just need like time to work on, but I'm just writing the ideas down and trying to get back to work and like setting my own goals and things. Hey, yes. My dog is like chasing his tail. I'm sorry. Come here. So what are you working on? Tell us a little bit about what you're working on. If you can.
So in theory, I have 2 books coming out next year, deadline dependent. But the first one is called Jennifer Chan is Not Alone. And that's a book about bullying in middle school and how to find redemption after hurting somebody, and also about searching for aliens. So that research process has been very fun.
Oh my gosh, that sounds so cool.
My editor said,
where is it set? Do you have a setting?
It's set in Florida.
Okay.
And my whole plan was to go on a research trip to Florida this past year. Obviously, that did not happen. So I'm making use of Google Images and Google Earth. But my editor said recently about the book that it is about feeling alienated while searching for aliens.
That's perfect.
What? That was one of those things where she was like, you didn't do that on purpose.
No. That's perfect.
Yeah, so that's the official tagline.
I love that.
And then
Anything else?
The other one is called Mihi Ever After, which is a younger, lighter middle grade series about a Korean American girl who goes through a portal into the Western fairy tales. So like the princess fairy tales, and she updates them a little bit to reflect her own life. So
I
that
love
was
that. What age is that going to
fun.
be for?
Slightly younger, like 7 to 9.
My daughter, she would love this.
It was kind of my fun project last year when COVID was just hitting and everything was so stressful.
Yeah.
And I just needed an escape. And so I thought, how about a book about escaping into princess stories?
I love that. You know what? I think there's going to be a lot of kids that love that. It's like that 7 to 9. That's like perfect because my daughter's just figuring out how to read and she's very into stuff like that, like kind of that fantasy fairy tale kind of thing. So we will definitely be in line to get that when it comes out.
Thank you.
What are you reading? Have you read anything that you like lately? Any like middle grade that you're excited about?
I feel like I'm always reading middle grade that I'm excited about because it's just a fun time to be writing in this category.
There's so much good middle grade out there.
Yes. I always recommend Kat Ye's books because she's just one of my favorite authors. She wrote The Truth About Twinkie Pie and The Way to Be.
I don't think I've read those. I'm gonna have to check those out.
She's great. Erin and Tae Keller, of course.
Oh,
amazing.
The queen.
I loved From the Desk of Zoe Washington.
That one was really good.
Yes, and Everything Sad is Untrue. I
haven't read that one. That one looks.
That
good,
one
though.
is great. It's a book about stories, so I feel like you.
Oh,
yeah,
that's up my alley.
It's excellent. What about you? What have you been reading?
So one of my most favorite. It's funny because I write really like dark, kind of not dark, but like sadder topics and things. So my favorite book last year. And she's probably irritated with me because I just talk about her book all the time because I loved it so much. But Stand Up Yumi Chung by Jessica Kim.
I love that book.
So cute. It was like it ripped my heart out and I laughed and I cried and it was like I can't stop talking about that book. I just love it so much. So that was like one of my favorites last year. And I think it's so different than anything I write. Like mine's like, you know, like a little bit sadder, a little bit more emotional or whatever, but she still hit all those emotional beats, but like still I was laughing and it was like comical how she got herself into these situations and yet totally believable. So I loved that. And really I have a lot of things like on my TBR. So I want to read Christina Soontorvant's A Wish in the Dark. It's on my list. Because that sounds gorgeous and I keep hearing good things about it.
Yeah.
Okay. And then I have them all right here. Cattywampus by Ash Van Otterloo. It's like a Appalachian magical book with LGBTQ characters. The Total Eclipse of Nestor Lopez by Adriana Cuevas is another one that is on my list as well. So these are the ones that I need to get to, but yes. But Jessica's was like my most favorite from last year just because it was so funny. And I wish I could write funny, but I write too serious, I think.
I love that book too.
You know. So I don't know, should we take questions or?
Yeah, I think so.
If Jennifer is there you go.
Yes, I couldn't type as fast as you guys were talking, but I did put a couple of links in the chat.
Oh, I can put some in there too.
To a couple of the items that you guys suggested in our catalog. And I had one more I was just pulling up here. Hold on just a second.
Oh, look, she's even got the links to the library. That's perfect.
Search in the catalog while you were talking. Yep. There we go. Okay.
Sorry, my dog. He's whining at me.
Okay.
Oh, good.
so I got a couple of them in there. All right, so
Okay.
I want to just talk about, you guys kind of started talking about this a little bit. Tae talked about the origin of her myths a lot, but Loriel, you didn't as much. So can you talk about where you kind of pulled some of that folklore and myth from?
Oh, I don't know. I think, it's funny because I think like in my family, there really weren't a lot of like folklore type stories that were told. My grandfather did tell me a little bit of stories, but they were more of like the stories I think, Tay, that you heard when you were making kimchi with your grandmother, where you were like, oh, these are like your real life. So he told me a lot of those kinds of things. But I, like, growing up, was so kind of obsessed with stories, and I don't know if it was an escape thing or what, but I really loved like being able to sort of dive into those stories and fall away from reality. And so when I was writing this book, I really wanted something where you could kind of escape into it, but there was still the pull of reality there, kind of sitting in the background, because that's how life is, right? Even when you're reading, you're still kind of pulled back out to your reality. And so I was trying to figure out, how do you like meld these myths and folklores and sort of stories with the reality? And to me, like, the framework of it became like the genetic part of the story. And so I had this like whole, I mean, if you actually are like a super science nerd, you can go into the book and like do a family tree of a mitochondrial inheritance pattern, and it will work, because in the original version, that's what I had. And my editor was like, this is pulling me out of the story. You need to get rid of it. And I was like, but I worked so hard on it. But that's like the framework of where the story sits on. It's actually like a scientific framework. But then like that could be kind of boring, I guess, to some. To me, it's fascinating. But so it was like, how to make that kind of cool and magical and like keep you in the story without pulling you out, was kind of that. So I don't know. I probably should like come up with some sort of pedigree that you could like fill out along with the book or something.
Ooh, that would be cool. And for people who are listening, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. Can you all talk about your writing process a little bit more? Are you a plotter? Are you a pantser? Do you have to have a certain setup, every time?
Tay, why don't you go first?
Oh, I am trying very hard to be a plotter. I think that me saying that I have 20 drafts kind of shows that I don't necessarily start with a cohesive plan. But if I did, it would make my life a lot easier. So that's what I'm trying to push myself a little bit more towards. And I don't think that I have any kind of setup that I need or anything except for tea. I feel like I need to have a cup of tea when I'm writing.
So when you start like drafting, do you have like rough plots, like, 7-point plots, the end, you just have an idea, like, or does it change with every book?
I usually have a sense of the characters and who they are. And I have an idea of what happens in Act 1 and a vague idea of Act 2. And then the ending, I have no idea, which is my biggest problem, because that's a pretty important thing to know.
Yeah.
So I'll be writing the first part and I'll feel so good. I'm like, oh, I got this. I'm good. And then I'll like get to the middle, and then I'll start to be a little bit wary. And then by 2/3, the book just stops. And
you're like, no.
Yeah. And every time I'm like, oh, but it'll work out. I'll figure it out as I go. And of course I don't.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's so funny. I really want to be a plotter as well. I'm kind of a pantser, but with like a caveat. So I usually know the ending. So I usually know like the first scene, and I know the last scene, and then I know nothing in the middle. And it's like that headlights thing where you just write a little bit and you keep going. But I do know the general like town I'm going to, like ending USA, and I'll get there eventually, but it's usually like real messy along the way. So that's like the revision has to kind of fix all of that. But like with Into the Tall Tall Grass, the beginning and the end has stayed the same. And it's the second book I've been working on. It's basically the same. There's like a little bit of like adjustments. The beginning and the end are basically what they've been the whole time. It's just the whole middle gets changed. And like, it's been a rough year because my kids are home, were 24/7. So like the little things I used to do to write, like don't really happen anymore, but they did finally go back to school last week. And I literally sat down with like a thing of water and popcorn, and it was like, and then focus. And it was like the best gift in a year of writing. It was wonderful. So I think now maybe I'm more flexible with like what I need to write. I remember I used to like put a candle on and like kind of put some music on and get in the mood and all this stuff. And now I'm like, oh no, just sit down and have some water. You're fine. Keep going. But I'm trying so hard to be a plotter too, Tae, and it's really hard because I don't usually know like where I'm going. Like I like those surprises too. So there is some very fun stuff with pantsing because you can really surprise yourself. I like one of the twists in Into the Tall Tall Grass I was not expecting, and I was like, if I had tried to plot this, it wouldn't have worked. But because it just sort of organically came out, it was like wonderful.
Yeah, and you do kind of get to know your characters and your story as you're actually writing, and that brings up new things that can happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
What's one piece of advice you would give to somebody who wants to be a writer?
I can go first. I would say just sit your butt down and write. I wanted to write for a really long time, and I was my own sort of block on that. I think I was worried that somebody might read it. I was like very almost embarrassed of my writing. And maybe not everyone feels like that, but it was a lot just to get me to sit down and like actually not be like embarrassed by writing. I think just because I was so worried someone was going to read it. And after I had my kids, I finally was like, well, what the heck? You're already like raising these little hooligans, and they only sleep for like an hour a day. So you got to do something for yourself. What would you want to do? I don't want to watch TV or, do laundry. So what would you do? And I was like, I would write. And so like, just sit down and write then. Like, what are you waiting for? And so I would say that's my piece of advice is like, just sit down and write, get it down, give yourself tiny goals along the way. I think my first book I wrote, I was like, you don't even have to write the whole book. Just write one chapter. And it took me like 2, afternoons, and I wrote the chapter and I said, well, what happens next? And so I just kind of kept myself in check for like, my own like expectations, like, right. Cause you think about, you're looking at this huge mountain that you have to write a book, and it's too much. So you just give yourself small attainable goals, but just sit your butt down and write. And like, don't judge yourself. Just do it. Nobody has to read it. They won't, I promise.
Yeah, that's such good advice. And I think that idea that we hold ourselves back so much because we're so worried about what other people will think if they read it. And that's always the advice that I try to give is just don't think about other people. Don't think about getting published. Just write for yourself because there's a reason why you want to write. And so lean into that reason, whether you have a story that you feel you need to tell, or maybe just because it's fun. It's fun to tell a story and to have these characters and have them interact. But write for yourself first.
I love that. That's perfect.
Yes, both of those. Those are both great pieces of advice. So I think we're going to end it there. So thank you both very much for spending time with us this evening. It was really great. And if you would like to purchase copies of Loriel and Tae's books, you can purchase them from Monkey and Dog Books, one of our local independents here that focuses on kids' books. And this is their contact information. And if you want to join us tomorrow night for a much different discussion, we are going to talk with Professor Frederick Gooding about the Oscars and African Americans who have won or been nominated for the Oscars. And of course, the Oscars are this weekend, so get yourself in the mood and in the spirit. So that is tomorrow night at 6:30. And thanks again, and everybody enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank
Thank
you. Thank you,
you.
Jennifer. Thanks,
Yeah.
Tae.